My uncle laughed and called me a bum because he got everything in inheritance while I got nothing. You know, funerals are always weird theater, especially when a main actor, your grandfather who raised you from childhood, is lying there, and you realize that for the past few years you felt like you were at your own funeral. The whole thing felt surreal, like watching a movie where you're both the audience and the guy getting buried alive. I'm Alex, 31 years old, recently optimized out of my local TV station job during another round of pandemic layoffs. Yeah, optimized. That's corporate speak for, we don't need you anymore, but we'll make it sound fancy. Now I live in a trailer that's smaller than most people's closets, feeling like my life went completely off the rails somewhere between my college journalism degree and reality hitting me like a freight train. Standing there in that cemetery in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, watching them lower my grandfather into ground, I felt completely hollow. People in black, sad faces, standard speeches that rolled off tongues like template responses from some old quiz show. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't just about Grandpa. This was about me, about my lost American dream, that now seemed like a mirage in the desert. The thing is, my grandfather wasn't just any old guy. He was the heart of my childhood. When my parents decided they were better suited for chasing their own dreams in California than raising a kid, Grandpa stepped up. No drama, no complaints. Just rolled up his sleeves and became dad, mom, and best friend all rolled into one stubborn old man who smelled like pipe tobacco and old film reels. His whole world revolved around the Liberty Bell Picture House. That wasn't just some random movie theater. It was a temple. The place where I spent every afternoon after school, every weekend, every summer day when other kids were riding bikes or playing video games. I was there in that magical darkness, watching Grandpa work his magic with those old projectors like he was conducting some invisible orchestra. I remember that smell butter from the popcorn machine mixed with the distinct scent of old film stock and that particular mustiness that only comes from decades of people sharing stories in the dark. Grandpa would let me sit in the projection booth, my legs dangling from that tall stool, watching him thread film through those mechanical beasts like he was performing surgery. Movies are time machines, kiddo, he'd say, adjusting the focus with practiced hands. One frame, and you're there, somewhere far away in your own world. I didn't understand then how prophetic those words were, how one day, one single frame would literally transport me into a completely different life. I particularly remember that evening when Grandpa and I watched The New Spirit in the theater. Just the two of us in that big empty space, watching Donald Duck learn about paying taxes during World War II. Sounds boring, right? But Grandpa made it feel important. He said, if you ever forget why it's important not to give up, remember Donald Duck, who pays his taxes and doesn't whine about it. I was 9 years old, and I thought to myself, if even a duck isn't scared, then I can somehow hang in there too. That cartoon was more than just a story about taxes for me. It was a reminder of Grandpa's wisdom and that the real spirit of America is not being afraid of hardships. But here's where life decided to kick me while I was down. There was no will. Grandpa always said lawyers were for cowards. If you love someone, you don't need paperwork to prove it, he used to tell me. Well, turns out you kind of do. I never believed in fate, but that day it seemed like destiny decided to flip me the bird. The Liberty Bell Picture House, the place I love more than anywhere else on earth, automatically went to Uncle Marvin, the successful developer. Turns out Marvin had been listed as co-owner for decades. On paper, it was just as much. In spirit, not even close. Marvin was everything I despised wrapped up in an expensive suit, a talking caricature corporate greed, who could probably sell his own grandmother for an extra percentage point. And there he was, right there at the cemetery, next to the freshly buried coffin, whispering something to the city council lawyer about investment potential. Some people are born to build things. Others are born to destroy everything you hold dear. The guy was trying so hard to look mournful, but his eyes were already burning with greed. His Armani suit seemed way too expensive for something as mundane as a funeral. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a commercial for successful business sharks who stop at nothing. not even the memory of their own father. I kept hearing Grandpa's voice in my head. Money is just a tool, kiddo. Real value is in what you build, not what you tear down. Marvin apparently missed that particular life lesson. Or maybe he just chose to ignore it in favor of dollar signs. And it gets worse. Uncle Marvin didn't just want to tear down the theater for some generic development. He wanted to turn it into Patriot Wing Sports Bar. Yeah, you heard that right. The irony wasn't lost on me. Taking a place that actually meant something patriotic and turning it into some fake patriotic dive bar. His advertising slogan, which I overheard him practicing, sounded like pure mockery. No more ancient movies, just real wings and patriotic cocktails. It was like spitting on Grandpa's grave. Or maybe that's exactly what it was. I felt crushed, completely defeated. So I decided to go to the Liberty Bell one last time to say goodbye, like you'd visit a dying friend in a hospital. This was my farewell pilgrimage to the temple of my childhood, before they turned it into just another sports bar where people could get drunk and pretend to be patriotic. When I got there, I saw Uncle Marvin cleaning the building, throwing everything onto a trash pile. Everything Grandpa had carefully maintained and preserved for decades was being treated like garbage. It was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. Marvin noticed me standing there, probably looking like a lost puppy. These old things are worthless anyway, he said, gesturing at the pile. Nobody buys this stuff anymore. Everything's digital now. People want Netflix, not some scratchy old films that smell like mothballs. But then I saw it, sitting there among all the junk like a wounded soldier after battle, but still maintaining its dignity. The old Yikei 16mm projector that Grandpa always fussed over like it was his own child, along with a beat-up cardboard box full of film reels. I remembered how Grandpa, laughing, used to call that projector my second wife. He'd spend hours maintaining it, cleaning it, talking to it like it could understand him. And maybe it could. Maybe that old machine held more wisdom than most people I knew. I walked up to Uncle Marvin, feeling embarrassed but desperate, like a kid asking if he could keep the stray dog he found. Hey, Uncle Marvin, you mind if I take this old projector and those films? I mean, if you're just throwing them away. His reaction was exactly what I expected from a guy who measured everything by its resale value. Take that junk if you want it. I don't need it. It's just a pile of old, worthless garbage. Take the radio, too, if you want. Or just throw it all away. I don't care. That moment was turning point number one. I felt relief, but also this weird sense of irony from fate. I carefully loaded the projector and film box into my beat-up Ford F-150, treating them like precious artifacts, which, as it turned out, they were. I was looking at this beat-up cardboard box and thinking, well, Grandpa, wherever you are, you'd probably be happy that I saved this stuff from ending up in a dumpster. Maybe you didn't plan this, but you always said good things come to those who don't give up on what matters. Back in my trail that night, I opened the box with the reverence of an archaeologist opening an ancient tomb. Inside were fragments of old newsreels, a Bugs Bunny cartoon, some random documentaries from the 40s. And then I found it, one reel with a strange handwritten label that made my heart skip about 3 beats. Disney Propaganda Cut, The New Spirit 1942, alt reel, official use only. My heart did a complete somersault. Official use only? In a box of trash? This was either the find of a lifetime or the beginning of my complete mental breakdown. Either way, it was about to change everything. I sat there in my cramped trailer, holding that reel like it was a live grenade. The weight of it felt different from the other films. Heavier, more important, like it was carrying decades of secrets that nobody was supposed to know about. The whole situation was surreal. Yesterday, I was an unemployed guy living in a trailer, mourning the loss of the only family I had left and watching some corporate shark destroy the only place that ever felt like home. Now I was potentially holding a piece of American history that wasn't supposed to exist. I stare at that label, official use only, like it might blink back at me. Grandpa, what the hell were you hiding? The questions were driving me crazy, but in a good way. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. Curiosity, hope, maybe even excitement. Like I was standing at the edge of a mystery that could change everything. I thought about Grandpa and how he always said that life has a way of putting the right things in front of you when you need them most. He used to tell me stories about how the most important discoveries happen by accident, like how he met Grandma at a movie theater when he was supposed to be somewhere else entirely. Maybe this wasn't planned at all. Maybe it was just dumb luck that I happened to be there when Marvin was throwing everything away. But Grandpa always believed that sometimes the most valuable things in life get overlooked by people who only see dollar signs. That real treasure isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone who actually cares enough to look. I carefully set the reel aside and looked at the rest of the contents. Everything else seemed normal, typical stuff you'd find in any old theater storage room. But that one reel with a mysterious label stood out like a diamond in a pile of rocks. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was worried or scared, but because my mind was racing with possibilities. What had Grandpa known about this film? Why had he kept it all these years? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with it now? I realized that Uncle Marvin, in his infinite greed and short-sightedness, had just given away something that could potentially be worth more than his entire sports bar project. The irony was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Here I was, the family failure, potentially holding a fortune that the family success story had literally thrown in the trash. It was like some cosmic joke, and for once, I wasn't the punchline. I was the guy who got the last laugh. As I finally drifted off to sleep that night, I could swear I heard Grandpa's voice one more time. One frame, kiddo. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out exactly what I had. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep with a smile on my face. Maybe the American dream wasn't dead after all. Maybe it was just hiding in the trash, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig to the pile and find it. And maybe, just maybe, that someone was me. My life in a trailer had never felt like a movie, more like some low-budget documentary about a midlife crisis. But that label on the film reel, official use only, instantly turned my sad existence into a real thriller. It felt like Walt Disney himself was winking at me from the past. I spent the next morning staring at that reel like it might spontaneously combust if I looked away. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, but I couldn't stop turning the thing over in my hands. This was like a detective game where the only clue was an old, worn label, and the stakes were my future. Or, at the very least, my next meal. I remember the new spirit from watching it with Grandpa. Classic Disney propaganda cartoon from 1942, designed to get Americans excited about paying their taxes during World War II. Sounds thrilling, right? But Grandpa always made it feel important when we watched it together in that old theater. He used to say that real patriotism wasn't just about flying a flag in your yard. It was about your contribution to the common cause. The cartoon showed Donald Duck learning his civic duty, and somehow Grandpa made that feel like the most heroic thing in the world. That's the kind of man he was. He could make paying taxes feel like saving democracy. But here's what made my hands shake. I knew from my journalism background that all alternative versions of these wartime Disney films were either destroyed or classified. Finding one was like discovering a lost Shakespeare manuscript in a pizza box, which, knowing my luck, was probably exactly what this was. Too good to be true. I sat there in my cramped trailer, surrounded by unpaid bills and rejection letters, holding what might be a piece of American history. The irony wasn't lost on me. Yesterday, I was a nobody living in a tin can. Today, I might be sitting on a gold mine that was literally thrown in the trash. That's when I decided to give that old projector box one more thorough search. Sometimes when you're desperate enough to find hope anywhere, you notice things you missed the first time around. I was pulling out every piece of foam padding, checking every corner, when my fingers found something I completely overlooked. Hidden in a compartment built into the side of the projector case was a small metal box with an engraving that made my hands shake. For Samuel A. Goddard from the Treasury Office. Samuel A. Goddard, my grandfather's full name. Inside that metal box were documents dated 1943, Official papers stating that a copy of the film had been given to certain theater owners as recognition for their assistance in promoting war bond sales. My grandfather wasn't just some guy who showed movies. He was part of something bigger, part of the war effort, part of history. The documents were signed by actual Treasury Department officials. This wasn't just a random film that ended up in Grandpa's collection. This was a reward, recognition for his contribution to the American war effort. I stared at those documents until my eyes burned. All my life, I thought Grandpa just loved movies. Turns out, he used them to fight fascism. I had no idea I was raised by a secret soldier of culture. The man who taught me about movies and life and doing the right thing had been quietly serving his country in ways I never knew about. Now I had not just mysterious film reel, but actual government documentation proving its legitimacy. This changed everything. This was no longer just a hunch or a hope. This was solid, documented proof. That's when I decided to call Professor William Hartley from the American Film Institute. I'd interviewed him once for a puff piece about film preservation when I still had a job that mattered. He was one of those academic types who knew everything about movies that normal people had never heard of. I dialed his number with trembling hands, like I was calling 911 to report an alien invasion. Honestly, I half expected him to hang up on me or recommend a good psychiatrist. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar gruff voice answered. Professor Hartley sounded exactly like you'd expect from a guy who spent his life in dusty archives. His voice was so dry, like he'd just swallowed pages from an old encyclopedia. I thought he was going to hang up before I even finished explaining why I was calling. Professor, this is Alex Goddard. We spoke a few years back about film preservation for Channel 8. I know this sounds crazy, but I think I found something you might want to hear about. There was a long pause. I could practically hear him rolling his eyes through the phone. Mr. Goddard, I get calls like this every week. Someone finds an old reel in their attic and thinks they've discovered the lost treasure of cinema. What makes you think your find is any different? Fair question. I took a deep breath and went for it. Well, it's a Disney reel from 1942. The New Spirit. But the label says, Alt Reel, official use only. And I have Treasury Department documentation from 1943 to prove its authenticity. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Then his voice came back, but completely different. Suddenly, he sounded like I just told him I'd found the holy grail of cinematography. Did you just say you have Treasury Department documentation? Mr. Goddard, I need you to be very, very careful with what you have. Don't touch either item any more than necessary. Can you bring everything to me? The way his tone changed sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just some old cartoon anymore. This was something that made a man who'd seen everything in the film world sound like he was about to hyperventilate with excitement. 3 days later, I found myself driving my beat-up Ford F-150 to the AFI campus in Los Angeles, that precious film reel, and the Treasury documents sitting in a climate control case I borrowed from a friend who collected vintage guitars. The 6-hour drive gave me plenty of time to think about what I was potentially walking into. Professor Hartley met me at his office, which looked exactly like what you'd expect from a film historian. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books, movie posters covering every inch of wall space, and the smell of old paper and caffeine. The man himself looked like he hadn't slept in days. Mr. Goddard, before we examine these items, I need you to understand something, he said, adjusting his thick glasses. If this is what I think it might be, you're holding something that officially doesn't exist. The government classified certain versions of wartime propaganda films, and most were destroyed. He carefully examined both the reel and the documents under a magnifying glass, muttering to himself like he was defusing a bomb. Every few seconds he'd make little sounds that made my heart race. Finally, he looked up at me with the expression of a man who just witnessed a miracle. Both items appear to be authentic, he said quietly. The film stock is correct for the period. The labeling matches Treasury Department protocols from 1942, and the documentation provides perfect provenance. This is extraordinary. I felt like I was going to throw up, or pass out, or both. What exactly does that mean, Professor? He smiled like he was about to deliver the best news of my life. "It means, Mr. Goddard, that you have found one of the rarest pieces of American film history ever created, with unquestionable authentication." Over the next 2 hours, Professor Hartley carefully examined every inch of that film reel. He explained that Disney had created several versions of The New Spirit, but most alternative cuts were considered too provocative for public consumption. The government was worried about public reaction to certain messages. The standard version shows Donald Duck learning about taxes, he explained while setting up a vintage projector. But rumor has it that alternative versions contain stronger patriotic messaging that officials deemed too intense for general audiences. My heart was pounding like I was about to rob a bank. This was it, the moment of truth. When the film started rolling, it looked normal at first. Same old Donald Duck, same tax education message. But then came the ending I'd never seen before. Instead of the standard conclusion, Donald Duck signs a war bond and delivers a line that made my blood run cold. "Freedom isn't free, it's prepaid in sacrifice." Professor Hartley paused the projector and turned to me with eyes wide as dinner plates. That line was cut from all public versions. Walt Disney himself refused to release it because censors thought it was too heavy for a cartoon character. I sat there in that dark room, watching Donald Duck deliver what might be the most powerful line ever spoken by an animated character, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about history, about truth, about messages that were too important to be lost forever. "Professor, what's something like this worth?" He leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. "To the right collector? Anywhere from $1.5 to $2.5 million. To a museum or archive? Priceless. To American history? Immeasurable. The film is worth between $1.5 and $2.5 million to private collectors," he continued. "But more importantly, it represents a piece of American history that was thought to be lost forever. Museums will fight over this. There are people who'd sell their Porsche just to hang this on their private wall. I had something in my hands that was worth more than all of Uncle Marvin's dreams put together. This wasn't just a film reel. This was my ticket to a new life, signed by Walt Disney himself." Meanwhile, back in Harrisburg, Uncle Marvin was continuing his assault on everything Grandpa had built. I'd been getting updates from old family friends about his latest publicity campaign. He was calling the Liberty Bell Picture House, an old cancer filled with mice and ghosts, pushing hard to get demolition permits approved. The man was like a bulldozer, charging toward his goal without noticing that he was running over a diamond mine. His greed had blinded him to everything except green dollar signs. If he only knew what he'd literally thrown away, he'd probably have a heart attack. Professor Hartley spent the next hour making phone calls to colleagues, auction houses, and film preservation societies. I could hear the excitement in every conversation. Words like unprecedented, extraordinary, and museum quality kept coming up. "Your grandfather was part of a network of theater owners who helped the government reach American audiences during the war," Professor Hartley explained between calls. They weren't just showing movies. They were helping to shape public opinion, boost morale, and fund the war effort. The weight of that realization hit me like a truck. Grandpa never bragged about his wartime service, never mentioned his role in the bigger picture. He just did his job, showed his movies, and served his community like a true hero. Finally, Professor Hartley hung up the phone and turned to me with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Mr. Goddard, I can officially confirm that what you have is genuine, historically significant, and extraordinarily valuable." My life suddenly didn't feel quite so small, and I didn't feel quite so helpless. For the first time in a long time, I felt something that might have been hope, or maybe it was just shock from hearing such an enormous number. Either way, sitting in that professor's office, holding proof that my grandfather was a genuine American hero, I realized that sometimes the most valuable things really are hidden where nobody thinks to look. Uncle Marvin had thrown away a fortune, but more than that, he'd thrown away a piece of our family's legacy, a piece of American history. And now it was mine to decide what to do with. As I drove back to Pennsylvania that night, those precious items secure in their case beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa. about how he'd quietly served his country, raised his grandson, and maintained that old theater as a temple to American storytelling, and how Uncle Marvin was about to learn just how much he'd underestimated the value of things that can't be measured in dollars and cents. I was heading home with more than just a valuable film. I was carrying a piece of my grandfather's secret history, a fortune that could change my life, and finally, some leverage against Uncle Marvin's bulldozer approach to progress. The American dream wasn't dead after all. It was just hiding in a box labeled official use only, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig through the trash and find it. Million. That word bounced around in my head like an escaped convict. I'd never dealt with that kind of money before. My biggest financial windfall was finding $20 in an old coat pocket, and that was probably 5 years ago. The drive back from Los Angeles felt like I was transporting nuclear material. Every bump in the road made me nervous. Every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I half expected to see some shady characters following me, like I was in some low-budget heist movie where the guy with the treasure never makes it home. I even tried to imagine myself as a millionaire. Picture this. Me, in my stained bathrobe, holding a mug of cold coffee, trying to conduct serious business negotiations while my trailer park neighbor chases Rooster around the yard outside. This was the American dream in action, just with a heavy dose of reality mixed in. My trailer had never felt smaller than when I realized it might soon be a temporary stop rather than a permanent address. But first, I had to figure out how to actually sell a piece of cinematic history without screwing it up completely. Professor Hartley had connected me with Heritage Auctions, one of the most prestigious auction houses in the country. Getting their attention felt like receiving an invitation to a fancy ball when you'd spent your whole life going to backyard barbecues. The first phone call was a disaster of epic proportions. I was trying to sound professional, but my voice kept betraying me like a teenager asking someone to prom. Yes, Mr. Goddard? You're certain this is authentic? The auction representative's voice dripped with a kind of skepticism, reserved for people claiming they'd found Bigfoot. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in my pajamas while my neighbor's dog is barking its head off outside, and I'm trying to explain that these are special negotiating circumstances. I even attempted to put on a collared shirt when the auctioneer called back, but then my neighbor knocked to borrow sugar, and I realized nobody could see my shirt to the phone anyway. My trailer became my unofficial office headquarters. Every important call happened while I was surrounded by unpaid bills, empty pizza boxes, and that old projector that wheezed and coughed like a chain smoker trying to run a marathon. The bureaucratic hurdles were mind-numbing. Forms to authenticate the film, forms to verify my ownership, forms to prove the forms were properly filled out. I started to think the government had more paperwork for selling a cartoon than for buying a house. But the representatives from Heritage Auctions slowly warmed up to my story, especially when Professor Hartley vouched for both the film and my character. Having a respected academic backing you up is like having a celebrity endorsement, except instead of selling sneakers, you're selling American history. While I was drowning in auction house bureaucracy, Uncle Marvin was ramping up his own campaign. He'd started holding actual press conferences about his plans for the Liberty Bell Picture House. Press conferences, like he was announcing a cure for cancer instead of another generic sports bar. I caught one of the speeches on the local radio while I was trying to figure out insurance requirements for transporting million-dollar film reels. His voice sounded like nails on a chalkboard, but I couldn't turn it off. It was like watching a car accident in slow motion. He kept calling the theater an old cancer filled with mice and ghosts, which made my blood boil. This was the place where Grandpa had raised me, where he'd quietly served his country, where generations of families had shared stories in the dark. And this guy was calling it cancer. We're bringing urban renewal, he announced with the confidence of a televangelist. A new spirit of economic growth to replace this outdated relic. Every time he said new spirit, I thought about that film reel sitting in my climate control case. If he only knew what real new spirit looked like. That's when it stopped being just about money for me. This was about Grandpa, about memory, about proving that some things can't be bought or sold, but they can be restored. Marvin's arrogance was fuel for my determination. Every condescending word he spoke made me more committed to not just making money, but to settling scores. I started wondering if I should go public with this story. Maybe call the local news. Show them what Uncle Marvin had literally thrown away. The irony was too perfect to keep to myself forever. Heritage Auctions wanted to schedule a formal appraisal and authentication session. They were sending experts from New York who specialized in Disney memorabilia and wartime propaganda. These people probably made more money in a year than my entire family tree had seen in generations. I spent 3 days cleaning my trailer like I was preparing for a presidential visit. Not that it helped much. You can polish a mobile home all you want, but it's still going to look like a mobile home when million-dollar art experts show up at your door. The experts arrived in a black SUV that probably cost more than my yearly salary back when I had a salary. Dr. Margaret Wells and her assistant James looked like they'd stepped out of a museum catalog, carrying cases that looked like they could survive a nuclear blast. They were professional but thorough during their preliminary examination. Dr. Wells carefully photographed every inch of the film canister and documentation, while James took detailed notes about the storage conditions and provenance. Mr. Goddard, Dr. Wells explained as they prepared to leave, for a complete authentication of something this potentially valuable, we need to conduct detailed laboratory analysis. We'll need to take the film and documents to our facility in Manhattan. My heart nearly stopped. You're taking it with you? This is standard procedure for high-value items, she assured me, though it didn't make me feel any better. We'll provide you with a detailed receipt and insurance documentation. You should have results within 5 business days. Watching them drive away with my million-dollar film felt like watching my lottery ticket blow away in the wind. What if something happened to it? What if they decided it was fake and just kept it? What if that black SUV got in an accident on the way back to New York? I spent the next 5 days checking my phone every 10 minutes like a nervous parent waiting for their teenager to text back. Every time it rang, my heart jumped. Every time it wasn't Dr. Wells, I felt like I was slowly dying of anticipation. Meanwhile, the first preliminary offers started trickling in based just on the photographs and Professor Hartley's initial assessment. Disney Archives called an offer of $300,000, contingent on authentication. A private collector from Texas followed with $600,000. I was holding phone conversations about amounts of money that made my head spin, all while staring at an empty space where my film reel used to sit. It felt like negotiating the sale of a unicorn that might not actually exist. On day 4, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Heritage Auctions to check on the status, trying to sound casual but probably coming across as completely neurotic. These things take time, Mr. Goddard, the representative assured me. Dr. Wells is very thorough. That's why her authentication carries so much weight in the market. That didn't make the waiting any easier. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios where the film turned out to be an elaborate fake, and I'd have to go back to my life of unemployment and ramen noodles. Finally, on Friday afternoon, my phone rang with a New York area code. I answered it so fast, I nearly dropped the device. Mr. Goddard, this is Dr. Wells. I have very good news for you. I think I held my breath for the next 30 seconds while she delivered her verdict. Authentic, museum quality, historically significant, and worth potentially more than anyone had initially estimated. The chemical analysis confirms authentic 1942 film stock, she continued. The Treasury Department documents check out completely. This is without question one of the most significant Disney discoveries in modern history. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. After they returned the film, which felt like being reunited with a long-lost family member, I called Heritage back with a proposal. I want to create a promotional campaign around the whole story. I told them, not just a film, but everything, how it was found, its connection to my grandfather's wartime service, the fact that it was literally rescued from a trash pile. People love underdog stories. I continued. And this has everything. History, family drama, a greedy villain, and a happy ending that hasn't happened yet. Heritage loved the idea. Suddenly I wasn't just selling a film. I was orchestrating my own comeback story. They started planning a media campaign that would make my little film reel famous before it ever hit the auction block. The preliminary bids kept climbing as word spread through collector circles. The Texas collector bumped his offer to $1.1 million. Then came whispers of philanthropists from Ohio who was preparing something even bigger. I suggested they include the story about Uncle Marvin throwing it away. People love seeing arrogant rich guys get their comeuppance. I told them. They agreed, but wanted to keep that part subtle. Professional revenge, they called it. My daily routine became surreal. I'd wake up in my cramped trailer, check my phone for $1 million offers like other people check the weather, then try to convince auction house representatives that I was a serious seller despite living in what was essentially a fancy camping trailer. The old projector became my good luck charm. Every morning I'd give it a little pat, like other people pet their cats. This machine had carried me from zero to potentially millions, and I wasn't about to forget that. Meanwhile, I kept waiting for Uncle Marvin to call. He hadn't yet, but something told me he would. Word travels fast in small towns, and eventually someone was going to mention that his worthless nephew was making headlines in the art world. The auction was scheduled for the following month. Heritage wanted time to properly market what they were calling one of the most significant Disney discoveries in modern auction history. Pre-auction estimates were ranging from $1.5 to $2.5 million. I kept thinking about Grandpa and what he would have thought about all this attention. He was never one for the spotlight, but I think he would have been proud that his quiet service to his country was finally getting recognized, even if it was 60 years too late. We're expecting this could go as high as $2.5 million. The lead auctioneer told me during our final pre-auction meeting. Maybe higher if we get a bidding war between institutional buyers and private collectors. $2.5 million. I'd gone from unemployment to potential millionaire status in less than 2 months, all thanks to a piece of trash that Uncle Marvin had literally thrown away. That night, I sat in my trailer with a beer that had never tasted better and tried to wrap my head around my new reality. 6 months ago, I was getting laid off from a job I hated. 3 months ago, I was wondering how I'd pay rent on a trailer. Last week, I was mourning the only family I had left. Now I was potentially sitting on enough money to change everything. Not just for me, but maybe even for that old theater that Uncle Marvin was so eager to destroy. I held my ticket to a new life in my hands, but somehow it felt heavier than I'd expected. These bids were better than empty pockets, but I knew the film was worth more. This felt like an invitation to a party where I knew the main event was still coming. And I realized this was just the beginning of a game that my grandfather had apparently started long before I was even born. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was winning. The American dream hadn't died after all. It had just been waiting in a box labeled official use only, ready to reward someone desperate enough to dig through the trash and believe in the impossible. But more than that, I was about to become an active player in my own story instead of just letting life happen to me. Uncle Marvin had no idea what was coming his way. D-Day had arrived. My heart was pounding like Donald Duck tap dancing in my chest, and I had butterflies the size of eagles doing barrel rolls in my stomach. I was sitting in my trailer, connected to the online auction, feeling like an astronaut on the launch pad about to take the biggest leap of my life. And I was absolutely certain this jump would either land me on the moon or send me crashing into the abyss. I'd already downed 3 cups of coffee to keep from passing out from nerves, and now my hands were shaking like I was trying to conduct a symphony on drums. Every few minutes, I'd check the auction site to make sure my internet connection was solid. The last thing I needed was to miss watching the biggest moment of my life, because my trailer park Wi-Fi decided to take a coffee break. Sitting there, holding the Heritage Auctions participation document, I felt like I was signing a deal with the devil. What if Grandpa hadn't wanted this to leave the family? What if it was supposed to stay here in the theater like a lighthouse guiding future generations? Maybe I was betraying his memory by selling what he'd so carefully preserved. But then I remembered his words. Don't hold on to things if they can become a chance for something bigger. And I realized this wasn't selling. This was passing history forward. This was giving that old spirit new life, even if not here in Harrisburg. It was a risk, but Grandpa always said life without risk is just a long wait for death. The auction started at exactly 2 p.m. Eastern. I watched the Heritage Auctions website like it was the Super Bowl, World Series, and presidential election all rolled into one. The opening bid was set at $200,000, which already felt surreal. 6 months ago, that would have been more money than I'd see in 5 years. Disney Archives jumped in first with $500,000. My neighbor's dog started barking outside, and I almost yelled at it to shut up because this was serious business. Then the private collector from Texas came back with $750,000, and I literally jumped out of my chair. Every new number on the screen felt like a punch in a heavyweight boxing match. Disney $600,000, and I nearly screamed. Texas collector $850, and I was bouncing around my trailer like a pinball. My neighbor, Old Bill, knocked on the wall and shouted something about whether I'd won the lottery or what. I just mumbled something about watching a very intense finale, even though this was a finale of my own life. The bidding slowed down around the $1 million mark, and I started getting nervous. Was this it? Was $1 million a ceiling? Don't get me wrong, $1 million would change everything for me. But Professor Hartley had said it could go higher. That's when something unexpected happened. Just when I thought the Texas collector was going to win at $1.1 million, a new bidder appeared on the screen. Someone identified only as Private Foundation, Ohio. Their first bid? $1.5 million. The virtual auction room went silent. Well, as silent as an online auction room can go. The chat's sidebar was exploding with comments from other observers. This was like watching cavalry arrive in an old Western movie, except without horses and entirely on the internet. The Texas collector tried to fight back with $1.6 million, but Ohio immediately countered with $1.8, then $2 million, then $2.2. I was watching numbers that represented more money than my entire family tree had probably earned in its collective history, and these people were throwing them around like they were betting on a poker hand. Finally, the hammer fell at $2.4 million. My finger had hovered over the keyboard during those final seconds like it was the nuclear button. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Grandpa's voice again. Be brave, but be kind with your victories. And I clicked to accept. The Ohio bidder had won, and I was officially a millionaire. After Heritage Auctions took their commission and covered various fees, I'd walk away with $1.7 million clear. But the story didn't end with the winning bid. That's when something happened that turned this whole thing from a commercial transaction into something much bigger. The winning bidder's representative made a public statement through the auction house that gave me chills. He said that he planned to show this film to every young American he could reach for as long as he lived, that they needed to know what their ancestors had fought for, that this film wasn't just history. It was a reminder of who we are and what we fight for. It was like thunder on a clear day. My grandfather, who always talked about the importance of history, would have been thrilled. My film reel, which had been sitting in a trash pile, was now going to be part of something bigger than money. It was going to educate people. It was going to preserve the memory of an entire generation who sacrificed everything for freedom. I stared at that final number, $2.4 million, and couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't just $1 million. This was my chance. My chance to change everything. The money was life-changing, sure. But what changed me more was knowing I'd restored a piece of truth. Something real. Something that mattered. But the universe apparently wasn't done with its cosmic jokes yet. The next day, still floating on cloud 9 from the auction, I discovered that Uncle Marvin had hit a brick wall of his own making. The demolition of the Liberty Bell Picture House had been delayed due to a complaint filed with the city's historical committee. Someone had submitted a copy of that 1943 Treasury Department document, the same one I'd found in Grandpa's projector case. Turns out that document didn't just prove the film's authenticity. It also officially registered the theater building as a temporary patriotic center during the war years. And apparently, that designation had never been formally removed from the city records. The building was protected from demolition under historical preservation laws. Uncle Marvin, who thought he was such a genius, had basically tied his own noose. He'd been so blinded by greed that he missed the obvious legal complications. It was perfect karma, delivered with a bow on top. I drove past the theater that afternoon and saw Uncle Marvin standing outside, talking frantically on his phone to what I assumed were lawyers or city officials. His face was red, his gestures were wild, and he looked like a man watching his dreams of sports bar empire crumble in real time. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a satisfied smile, not because I enjoyed seeing family members suffer, but because justice felt like it was finally being served. Standing there looking at that old theater, I felt like Donald Duck himself was winking at me from the movie screen, and Grandpa was smiling somewhere up above. Fate had finally decided to play by my rules for once, and I knew that now I had more than just money. I had the opportunity to restore Grandpa's legacy, not just as a building, but as a symbol that real values never disappear, even when they get thrown in the trash. The irony was beautiful in its completeness. Uncle Marvin had thrown away millions of dollars because he couldn't see value beyond square footage and profit margins. Meanwhile, his failure, nephew had turned that same trash into a fortune and a chance to save the very thing Marvin was trying to destroy. I realized this was just the beginning of the next chapter, the chapter where I got to write my own ending instead of just watching life happen to me. Uncle Marvin had no idea what was coming his way. That night, I sat in my trailer one last time as a poor man, drinking a beer that tasted like victory and planning what came next. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of becoming someone different, someone who could fight back, someone who could honor his grandfather's memory in ways that actually mattered. The American dream hadn't been dead after all. It had just been waiting for someone desperate enough to dig through the trash and stubborn enough to believe in the impossible. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win in the end, even if they have to win from a trailer park with questionable internet and neighbors who chase roosters around the yard. The best part? This story was far from over. You know, becoming a millionaire when yesterday you were just a loser in the trailer feels like starring in your own movie with a happy ending. Except now you're not just the audience. You're the writer, director, and leading man. And the first scene I wrote was all about Uncle Marvin. Walking into his office with a briefcase full of bank documents felt like the greatest power move of my life. I offered to buy the Liberty Bell Picture House for $250,000 cash. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see his face when his worthless nephew suddenly became the one calling the shots. Uncle Marvin, who just yesterday had called me a bum, now stared at me like I had just descended from Mars. His face was like a canvas where all shades of surprise, anger, and barely concealed envy mixed together in real time. He tried to keep his composure, but that nervous twitch under his left eye gave away his true emotions. This was the moment of maximum, sweet justice. The man who'd thrown away millions was now forced to sell me the very thing he'd tried to destroy, for a fraction of what it was actually worth. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. But even after depositing that $1.7 million check, I sat in my trailer and felt empty. Money is great, don't get me wrong, but it didn't fill the hole that had formed in my soul after losing Grandpa, after years of failure and rejection. It was like in the movies when a hero wins but doesn't know what to do next. Because when you dream about something for so long and then get it, you have to learn how to dream all over again. And that's when I remembered I didn't just want money. I wanted someone to believe in that old theater again, to bring it back to life. And I realized that someone was me. I invested $350,000 into completely restoring the theater. But this wasn't just renovation. This was resurrection. Every piece of plaster, every shade of paint was chosen with love, with thoughts of Grandpa guiding every decision. We found old blueprints and photographs from the 1940s. I wanted everyone who walked through those doors to feel like they'd stepped into another time, back when America still had that genuine spirit that seemed to be fading from the world. The walls were painted in authentic 1940s colors. We installed a restored popcorn machine that filled the lobby with that unmistakable aroma of butter and possibility. The neon sign was completely rebuilt to shine like a beacon in the night, just like it used to when it drew people in like moths to a flame. I renamed it the New Spirit Theater. This wasn't just a business project. This was a personal mission, the realization of Grandpa's old dream and my own childhood fantasy. Every day during construction, I'd sit in that old projection booth where Grandpa had taught me about movies and life. I could almost hear his voice approving of every decision, every detail that brought his theater back to its former glory. This was my contribution to a legacy that Uncle Marvin had tried to bury. The grand opening day arrived like Christmas morning for a kid who'd been good all year. The air was electric with anticipation, like before the premiere of some major blockbuster. Except this blockbuster was about life, about memory, about second chances. I decided to show the original copy of the film, properly scanned and legally cleared for public viewing. But before the lights went down, I had one more surprise planned. On the big screen appeared a photograph of Grandpa in his military uniform, holding that same projector I'd rescued from the trash. Young, smiling, proud. It was like he was speaking from the screen. "Here you go, kiddo." Mission accomplished. The audience, a mix of elderly veterans, families, and kids who'd never seen a cartoon on the big screen, fell completely silent. You could feel the weight of history in that room. The connection between past and present that movies can create when they're shown with love and respect. When Donald Duck delivered that censored line about freedom being prepaid and sacrifice, I watched old veterans in the front rows wipe away tears. This wasn't just entertainment. This was memory made real. As the national anthem played during the closing credits, every single person in that theater stood up, hands over hearts. It was a moment of pure, unshakable pride. I watched those people standing together and realized this wasn't just about movies. This was about community, about remembering who we are. After the lights came up, an elderly veteran slowly approached me. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. He looked like he was carrying the weight of decades, but also the dignity that comes from having served something bigger than yourself. "Son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was 19 when I first saw this cartoon. It was 1943, right before I shipped out to Pacific. My dad brought me to this very theater, told me that Duck was going to teach me something important about being American." He paused, looking around at the restored lobby. "I never thought I'd see it again on a big screen. Thank you, not for the movie, but for the memory, for giving me back a piece of my father and a piece of myself." I told him it wasn't me. It was my grandfather. I just pressed play. Grandpa always believed that real stories should live forever, and that's exactly what happened that night. Standing there in that restored theater, watching people share stories and memories, I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach me all those years. Success isn't just about personal achievement. It's about being part of something that matters. Uncle Marvin never did call. Word around town was that his sports bar project had fallen through completely after the historical designation fiasco. Some people said he'd left town altogether, probably to find some other place to develop. The universe has a funny way of settling scores. The theater started showing a mix of classic films and new releases, but every month we'd have a special screening of The New Spirit for local schools and community groups. Each time, I'd tell the story of how it was found and what it meant to my grandfather. Kids would ask me if I was rich now, and I'd tell them that rich is a complicated word. I had money, sure, but more importantly, I had purpose. I had a place where I belonged. The American dream hadn't been dead after all. It had just been waiting in a box labeled official use only. But the real treasure wasn't the money from selling that film. It was learning that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought or sold. They're the things you build, the communities you serve, the memories you help preserve. I went from being thrown away like garbage to becoming someone who could make a difference. And you know what? That transformation happened one frame at a time, just like Grandpa always said. Now, when I look at that neon sign for the New Spirit Theater lighting up Main Street, I know Grandpa will be proud. And for the first time in a long time, I'm proud of myself too. Sometimes, to find your place in the world, you just need to dig through someone else's trash. Who would have thought, right? Life really is like the movies. The important thing is not to miss your moment when it comes. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win in the end. Even if they have to do it one frame at a time, from a trailer park with questionable Wi-Fi and neighbors who chase roosters. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because the best stories, the ones worth preserving, never really end. They just keep inspiring new chapters in other people's lives. That's what Grandpa would have wanted. That's what America is really about. And that's what happens when you refuse to give up on the things that matter most.